We're now here at the movement's annual Bible conference, and we want to give a brief review of the business meetings that were held this past week between the leadership of the movement and FFA, the leading ministry in the United States. I'm sure we're all aware that for the last 3 years or so, Elder Jeff has spoken about retiring and stepping back from frontline ministry work. He's had both personal reasons, health reasons, and the way he's explained it, prophetic reasons to do so. His desire to retire has increased over the years. He's resolved to do that, and it really came to a head this spring, around March 2019, where he publicly stated that he would resign and that the leadership of the movement, through the symbol of a mantle based upon the story of Elijah giving the mantle to Elisha, that he would step back and someone else would take essentially a responsibility for leading the movement. The story of Elijah, Elisha were not the only models that he used. There was Moses and Joshua. We're all aware of John and Jesus, the first and second angels' messages, Miller and Snow. There are a number of models we have that show that there's this transfer of leadership. Many people who have left the movement have gone back into those prophetic lines and have tried to make judgments about what's going to happen in our reform line based upon those histories. And pretty consistently as a movement, we've resisted those thoughts and those ideas. When Elder Jeff chose to retire and transfer responsibility from himself to myself, there's a history behind that. Stretches all the way back to 2016, when the subject of organisation needed to be addressed. It began to be spoken about perhaps a year or so before in presentations. And in 2016, the beginning of the year, we had a series of meetings in Arkansas where we began to formalise the work of organisation. It began by ordaining 3 brethren to the position of continental leaders who would oversee the work in various parts of the world. What was not discussed at those meetings was the role of Elder Jeff. And the reason for that is because of his position in the movement, that they felt there wasn't a necessity to talk about his position. It was assumed that he was still the leader, and it was assumed that he would essentially continue to run or have responsibility for the United States as per the name of his ministry, Future for America. Previous to that, Future for America had started a School of the Prophets, and that had been running for a few years, and that becomes part of this narrative. So if we come back to the spring of this year, he makes this public statement that there's going to be a transfer of leadership from himself to myself. When that decision was made, or the statement was given, there was no communication between himself and me. I found out about that through the videos or the video presentation, as well as everyone else. I never had never was given any warning or insight, except that he had pretty consistently said he was going to retire, which I think most people already knew. So I just want to make that point clear. I was in the midst of a heavy teaching schedule when those announcements were made, so nothing was essentially done about that. Just put it on mute. From the spring of this year to June, we had very little communication. It was just communication on issues that needed to be addressed. So I was really left blind about what my role would be. Elder Tabo, Marco and myself met in Canada at a camp meeting, and as we were all together at that time, we had a series of meetings to try and address how we move forward in the movement. Elder Jeff had previously communicated with us through email with a series of questions, I guess his point of view on things, and was waiting for us to respond on essentially what he should be doing as we move forward, that it was our responsibility to lead the movement as he had gone into retirement. There is a component to that communication. I'm going to go back to the spring 2019. At the camp meeting in March in Arkansas, we did a series of presentations, I think it may have been one or two, that was essentially dealing with the subject half right, half wrong. I'm not even sure the title of the presentation was that, it may have been, but that was the essence of that study. Sister Tessa and myself were in Brazil at the time when we had heard of that study, had analysed it. It became apparent quite quickly the ramifications of what that study meant. So I'll give a brief summary of what that study was. Based upon previous reform lines, particularly the 1888 history and the relationship between Wagner and Butler, who was the General Conference president or the leader of the church, there was a struggle. That struggle was based upon a previous disagreement with Wagner's father. So there'd been a struggle with Wagner's father. His son then picked up the mantle and continued that struggle, and in the history just before 1888, this fight began to emerge between the leadership or the leader of the church and Wagner. If you go to that history, based upon Ellen White's analysis of that, both Butler and Wagner were half right and half wrong. If I can say as simply as this, it's not this, the study's more complex. If you go to the book of Galatians and you begin to discuss the law in the book of Galatians, some people felt that the law that was referred to was the ceremonial law, and some people felt it was the moral law or the Ten Commandments, and there was this disagreement. Wagner and his father had taken the position that it was the moral law. Butler, who led the conference, the church, had taken the position that it was the ceremonial law, and they were fighting over this issue. Ellen White then said, neither of their positions is correct. And she said, it's both the moral and the ceremonial law. Hence the idea that both were half right and half wrong. Butler was half right that it was ceremonial, half wrong that it was moral. or that it wasn't moral, and obviously the opposite goes with Wagner. If you take that story and bring it into our own dispensation, what Elder Jeff did was to take that dynamic and bring it into the 2012-2014 dispensation of our movement, and began to make an application to say that both he and I, therefore inferring that he was Butler and that I was Wagner, that I was half right and half wrong in the prophetic application back in 2012, that in 2 years, 2014, there was to be a Sunday law in fulfillment of Daniel 11:41. There was this idea that I was half right, that there indeed was to be this Sunday law, but I was half wrong, that it was not the fulfillment of Daniel 11:41. The reason why we had concerns about that study, as we reflected upon it, is because of the implications of what that meant. And what Elder Jeff did not seem to be aware of when he made those assertions, when he did that study, was the following thought. We understand the line of the priest fairly well. (1989), 9/11, Panium, Raphia, 2014. (2019), 2021. Panium, Raphia, Sunday law, close of probation, second advent. This is the line of the priest as we understand it, and as we've understood it for some time. I think everybody was in agreement with this. I would say long before September, October last year, when the Midnight Cry came into this movement. But this line has been developed since then. We've had a much clearer understanding of how to relate to this line. If you want to refer to what I'm going to say in a moment, please go back to the studies that were done in France this summer. If you want to look at the details of many of the truths that have been presented at camp meetings all through this year, you should go and watch the studies in Brazil and France, particularly because they're class settings and everything is done at a slow, measured pace. The camp meetings themselves are summary positions of what was taught. So when you take this line, we can essentially break the line into 4 parts. So we can take a singular story that can be broken down into 4 segments. And when you do that, each one of those 4 segments actually has a new start. If you go back to the studies that we did at this camp meeting, you'll see that we spoke about this before. So this would be the beginning. I'll put commencement for C. This would be the commencement. So we would have 4 commencements. And that means you can take each one of these dispensations and drop them underneath. You can do line upon line in the history or the line of the priests. That's reasonably well established. I'm not sure how familiar each of us are of how and why we can do this. The reason why this becomes significant is because of the tension of a line of progression and repeat and enlarge. Because if we go into this history, we know that we have 2 dates here, and we have 2 here, and 2 here, and therefore by inference, or upon the testimony of 2, we have 2 waymarks here. So we realise that there are 2 waymarks in each of these histories, and as you run through this progressively, the implications of that are not apparent. Part of the reason why they're not apparent is because we've had a bad habit in our movement of not running a thread or a storyline, a story through our line, which we now see is critical to make sure that we're not making mistakes. So what we've understood is that this is the time of the end, this is the increase of knowledge, and this is the formalization, and this is a shut door. And once we understand that, everybody's familiar that this was 91, 96. That leads you to the idea that we only had an increase of knowledge at the beginning of our reform line, and then we moved on, which is true. This is the ploughing, the former rain, latter rain, harvest. So there's a sequence. So these waymarks that come after are not these waymarks. However, when you break this line, what you can show really easily is that 9/11 becomes a start. 2014 becomes a start. Closed probation becomes a start. And you can just conceptualize that. This would be the start of the Sunday law. This would be the start of Jacob's time of trouble. We can understand it in a conventional way. The reason why that becomes significant is when you cut these lines up and you say this is the start of the Sunday law, that start has 2 characteristics. It's the start of something that began way back here, a message about the Sunday law, and then the Sunday law starts. But because this is the start, we can take that and bring it back here. When you do that, this then becomes the beginning or the commencement, or we could say the time of the end. It has that property or characteristic about it. Once we do that, then we can identify that each of these waymarks is an increase of knowledge and also a formalization. And that becomes significant. This concept wasn't formalized in a public way like this until quite recently, after the presentation that Elder Jeff had done. But the idea behind it was already well established. It just wasn't presented in this way. The reason why this becomes significant is because when we look at the characteristic of the formalization, this is the point where you're tested. This is why you've heard Sister Tess say that November the 9th is not our test. The test happens before. If you want to take it in a really simplistic way, which has its own weaknesses, November the 9th is where you receive your certificate for passing your exam, for passing the test, if I could say it that way. It's not saying it's 100% accurate to this idea, but if in a simplistic way, if I was going to say when is your test, the test is not there, that's when you receive the results. The test is before. So if the formalization is the test, if you come back to this history, this becomes 2012, and often people think this is 2005, but this is 2009. Each one of these dispensations has a different test, a different theme. There's an increase of knowledge on one theme, an increase of knowledge on another, and you can go through. Elder Jeff took that story of 1888 and brought it into a present truth application here, 2012 to 2014, that essentially I, like Wagner, was half right and half wrong. I was right that there was going to be a Sunday law, but I was wrong that it was the Sunday law of Daniel 11 verse 41. Because of that dynamic, Therefore, it has an implication of what's going on in the history that we find ourselves. The reason, not the moral reason, the prophetic reason of why that argument is happening is to explain why the leadership has not accepted the message in this history. I'm not inferring that an excuse was being made deliberately or consciously, but it's a version of events to basically downplay the negative response by the movement to what was going on in this history. Because if someone is half wrong, then you have a legitimate right to say, maybe I don't have to believe you, because you could be only half right. I hope we can all see the implications of all of that. And the reason why that becomes significant is because in this history there was an implied statement, if not direct, that the leadership of the movement had failed. They'd failed the movement. And part of the response to justify the cause or the nature of that failure was to infer that there was something half right and half wrong going on there. If you were to do that, first of all, you'd have to go back to the history of 1888 and make the inference that Butler, who represents the leadership of the church, was half right and half wrong. And I'm not sure if we would even make that assertion in the original story, because I'm not convinced or persuaded that Ellen White had that perspective. Coming back to this story, the reason why this becomes significant is because our understanding is that Elder Jeff did not understand what this waymark meant when he was doing that study, because it just becomes a waymark in our history. I don't want to say it's random, but it doesn't have any connection going forward or backward. It's just something that happened slightly before 2014. There was a recognition that it was 2 years before. The reason that becomes significant is because often we have this 2 years before something happened, particularly in the story of Josiah Litch, 1838, 2 years before the event, he already was making a prediction. So that's not the only story, but these 2 years become significant. But that's a minor point. The point that we want you to see is that when you see this repeating pattern and this becomes the formalization of the message, this becomes the test. And the reason why that becomes significant is because when you see the characteristics of the formalization of the message, it's not just the test, it's even a more potent waymark than that, because it takes the properties of the midnight cry. So these are all midnight cries or loud cries. And a continual complaint by many people, even at this camp meeting, is we accept portions of the midnight cry, like November the 9th, but we're questioning, if not doubting, other portions of the midnight cry, like gender equality or nationalism or women wearing trousers. What's that got to do with the midnight cry? People have struggled with that, and it's introduced a level of unbelief. And the reason why we have strongly resisted that is not to defend ourselves and our position on that, but it's to state what all of us should already have known from the very beginning, that the nature or property of the midnight cry is that it is without mistakes. And if you don't have that perspective, none of this will make sense. The Millerite line will not make sense. Christ line will not make sense. It cascades all the way through, and you no longer have a reform line if you hold the position that the midnight cry has some kind of inbuilt mistake or error in it. So our position is that cannot be. We have historical examples to show that. If you go to the previous reform lines, there are no mistakes. There are misreadings. Jesus is indeed about to be made king of Israel when he enters into Jerusalem on the triumphal entry, but it's not the type of king that they think. It's a different type of a king, and therefore when he gets crucified, it may appear to be a line of failure, but it's in fact a line of success, and there are no mistakes about what Christ is trying to teach in that history. I do want to make a point there that he prophesied, if you do not give the cry, the midnight cry, the loud cry, the stones will do it for you. And we're in that exact scenario, that exact history, in our history, where the triumphal entry is being fulfilled, and we already know, we actually know their names. The stones are crying out. We actually know the names of those stones. That's a separate point. The reason why this becomes significant is if there's a mistake here, which is half right and half wrong in 2012, then we are essentially saying this. In the test of our dispensation, 2018 to 2019, which we know is the midnight cry message, then we either state plainly, we infer, or we suggest that there could be a mistake in our history. And it opens up a huge uncertainty. Now, we're not just trying to plug that uncertainty so that you have confidence. We want to say that it's a prophetic subject, that this waymark has no mistakes to it. And what is not being seen when the study was done here in March, firstly, it was not a correct application back there, but when you bring it into our history, the other thing that people are not seeing is the subject of dispensationalism, and how people are not able to see past their own dispensations. And if our dispensation, the shut door, ended in 2014, which this model teaches, then we know that back in 2012, the only thing this movement could have done would to predict the Sunday law, which would be the Sunday law of Daniel 11:41. That is not a mistake, it's a function of dispensationalism. And if you claim that to be a mistake, then you destroy dispensationalism, you destroy the foundation of parable teaching. I don't think people understand the significance of what happened in March this year, about the wrong prophetic model that was used to describe the beginning of our history, and also the reason why there was such a strong, robust defense of the position that we're now holding to. In the midst of all of that, Bible study, which is what all it ever should have just been a Bible study between brethren, it became personal. It not only became personal on an individual level, people began to defend their champions. And it then became a dangerous situation where people took this out of just a plain Bible study to a personal level, where people would begin to defend those who were making these statements. And that defense was not based upon prophetic models, it was based upon hurt feelings. And we see that, I'm not saying as the beginning, but a clear step to the point where we now find ourselves, that this movement is in a crisis. I'm not saying it was the beginning point, but it's a key component to what happened. And it's in that very history that Elder Jeff officially resigned his position. So that becomes an important point for us to understand. The lines show that 2012 was not 50% right, it was 100% right. Because everyone here believes that the Time of the End magazine was not 50% right and 50% wrong. Even with the refinement of information that we have, because what we teach is in this dispensation, that's all the light that we had. And based upon that idea, we accept the legitimacy of this document has been the formalisation of the message. And if we're going to hold that to be true, 2012 must be true, as must 2018. Another characteristic of the Midnight Cry, that each one is connected to the subject of time. We addressed that at our camp meeting. 2012 is the subject of time, 2018 is, so is the Time of the End magazine. So this is part of the backdrop of where we are today with respect to Elder Jeff's retirement and me being given responsibility as the leader of the movement. Following the meetings in June, I travelled to Arkansas for about 5 days, and the purpose of that was to have business meetings, both with FFA and with the local fellowship, Lambert Church Fellowship, which I did. Let me say to begin with, all the meetings that I had were all positive. There were no issues of animosity or fear. Everybody seemed to be honest brokers to accepting what Elder Jeff had requested, that I was to be the leader. Everybody gave me their assurance of support. Following that meeting, there were a series of open letters that were sent by myself to both Lambert and FFA to explain my role to them and also their role to each other. And it was decided, it was understood that it was at this camp meeting that we would have business meetings to further define the role of FFA as we move forward. In the meeting in June, I had a series of meetings, first of all with Elder Jeff, and the meetings that I had with him were cordial, respectful, and I had the assurance from him, the personal assurance, that he and I were 100% in agreement, that he had accepted the Midnight Cry message, he accepted our prophetic understanding of what was going on, he saw the wisdom of retirement, and that he was happy that I was the person that was going to lead out in the movement. All things that he had essentially either chosen for himself or decided for himself. My meetings with FFA, which was with the 4 workers, the 4 people who either run FFA, the School of the Prophets, the interaction between those 2 ministries is fluid, that they were happy that I was the leader of the movement, and that they would be willing to work in cooperation with me. So there needed to be some clarification in those meetings, which I did, and that leads me on to the next thought. This is a very basic overview of how our movement is organised. There's a continental leader, I'll give an example. I just say Africa. And there's a leader there. There are countries, and there is a local ministry and a leader. And these 2 leaders are normally, in fact, I think in every situation that we have across the world, they're different people. Whether you go to South America, whether you go to Europe, Australasia, or Africa, every single continent has this setup, and these 2 people are different. So I'll put leader 1, leader 2. For Africa, this is Elder Tabo. For South America, this is Elder Marco. For Europe, this was me. This structure was set up in 2016. It's been functioning for the last 3 years, I believe successfully. But no attention was paid to how things work in the United States. So I'm going to put the USA here, North America as a continent. And the leader here was Elder Jeff. And then when it came to the local ministry, things began to be different because the leader here was Elder Jeff. This is a very simplistic model. It's more nuanced than that. It's slightly more complicated. And so straight away you can see that the person is the same and they're different. And from my understanding, the conversations that I've had, this has introduced confusion in North America, and more than confusion, it's actually crippled the way in which the movement operates in that continent, because there are not clear levels of responsibility of who's doing what. Accountability gets thrown out the window because this ministry is accountable to nobody, because the person that are accountable is the person themselves. Whereas in any other part of the world field, any country, it's always accountable to someone above them. As I say, this is not, this is an oversimplistic view of how our movement operates, but it's suffice to make the point. FFA has been split since around, I think, 2013, around 6 or 7 years, that kind of time period, between the School of the Prophets and what we would call Future for America. And Sister Bronwyn has essentially been running the School of the Prophets, but she also functions as one of the main administrators for FFA. So her position is fluid, but she's essentially the leader of this part of their ministry. She works in close relationship with Elder Jeff. This is nothing new. This is well understood by those who work there, who live in the area, and by those who have asked, who have any interaction with them. Everything's fine, easily understood. When I was given responsibility for the work across the world field that Elder Jeff had, people did not understand, I think, that he would retire from this position and also from this position. So he was the leader of the world, across the worldwide, which would be Elder Jeff. And then I was given responsibility. And if I put the USA here, this would be me. I want to reiterate, the problem that began to occur here was partly based upon the fact that this was not disseminated by Elder Jeff. This information was given by myself because I had to work out my own job role and my own organisational structure, because it was not handed to me. We never had like a job description given to me. It was Elder Tabo, Elder Marco and myself back in June that began to discuss this thing and look at the implications of what retirement actually meant. So when I went in June, I think many people in Arkansas were surprised of the ramifications of the retirement of Elder Jeff. A number of them didn't even know what his role in the movement was, except this nebulous idea that he's the leader across the world. They weren't actually clear about what he was doing. So let me put him up here. And I'll put myself up here. When it came to FFA, and I'll put in parenthesis, School of the Prophets, at those meetings, what I requested was that Sister Bronwyn would be the president of the ministry. Elder Jeff had left. She was already functioning in that capacity to some degree, not autonomously, but in connection with him, at this level, not this level. And essentially she was told that she would be the leader of these two ministries. So this was her post. It was clearly told that she would be the president of this ministry. It was clear that I was the head or the leader in the USA, in addition to my role as leader of the worldwide movement. And whether or not FFA realised it or not, consciously, I certainly didn't, there seemed to be some kind of idea that I was also here somewhere as some kind of local leader for FFA School of the Prophets. And this is where problems began to arise at this camp meeting, not before, because no discussion was had on this relationship. So I'm going to put a line through here, because I never had that role, because I'm basing it upon a model that looks like this: a local leader and then a continental leader. But I think in her mind, or even perhaps FFA's mind in general, they thought that there was this relationship here, and there never was. We recognise that there's a dilemma here, and if I want to use the phrase a legacy issue. There was a legacy issue about this, because this is not a healthy way to operate. And I already tried to put into place plans, although I didn't do that in June, I haven't really done that now, about how to disengage myself from direct responsibility of the USA, because it's not a healthy relationship, because you have no accountability. At the moment, it's there, but it's not going to be a permanent thing. It should not be, because you just have no accountability from the very top of the movement to what this ministry is doing. And it's not a healthy way to run an organisation. Anybody who's in a who works for a company knows that this is not a healthy way to operate. In fact, not only is it not a healthy way to operate in a business organisation, we all know the counsel that Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, gave to him, that he says, you will burn out if you do this, this and this. It's a model that's not in agreement with God's plan of organisation. And he counselled him to break up the structure and have different people in these three levels. Ellen White's commentary on that is that when his advice was taken, it was nothing but good advice. In fact, it was ordained by God, or led by God, or God was in agreement with that. So we know that this model is not a divine model. It's a model that Moses had, and that he had to correct following counsel, which he did. This model is based upon the concept or idea that Jethro has. It may be imperfect, but it follows that plan. It doesn't go from the thousands to the hundreds it doesn't go all the way down at multiple levels, but the principle is there. That's what I want us to see. This principle is not there. So when I took over responsibility for the worldwide movement, I want to put in place a model based upon Jethro's model, a model that we already have. But there's already some kind of miscommunication at this level, which surfaces here at this camp meeting. In addition to that, in June, in agreement with the setup that it's always been, I wanted to have clearly defined roles here about how this relationship would work. It's not new. We're already in negotiation with other ministries to try to do the same. And what we want to see is that there would be a person here, leader one, whether that's a board or an individual, but we have someone here, and there would be FFA and School of the Prophets. A word that we're using increasingly now is the word autonomy. What that means, if you're not familiar with that, is to delegate. We want work to be delegated, to be cascaded down. Again, this is following the model, the biblical model, as I've discussed a few moments ago. So these two parts of this ministry should be autonomous from each other, and they should have their own scope of work, and they should be free to do that based upon the direction that the leader gives. We've discussed this subject of communication. There should be upward communication and then downward communication. It may seem unwieldy when we talk about it, but in practice, it actually works really easily. It's a fluid relationship, and if it's built upon a relationship of trust, it often just takes a conversation or a small written communication. It's relatively straightforward. So we saw all of this as not being painful moves for anyone. It was refinement of what had already been established. When these thoughts and ideas began to be shared with the board of FFA, not the legal board, but the working board, initially the idea was accepted back in June, when it was just a high-level idea. From June to July, there began to be concerns that I was not directly made aware of by the president of this ministry, that there was things that there were concerns. So we come to this CAP meeting, we begin to have business meetings to flesh out or to define what this structure would look like, putting names to various job functions. And in that discussion, there was a breakdown of communication between the leadership of this movement, the four elders, and FFA here at this ministry. I use FFA to represent both of those entities as a singular thought. If I could do it this way, I want to call this FFA, and I want to take this out, and I want to call it ministry, to give the idea that what this role, the expectation is to minister to the needs of the flock over the jurisdiction or the territory that they have. So this ministry is to minister to the flock in the United States. The purpose of this entity is to run a school, a training school, and they should be separate and distinct. It's been that way for a number of years, but because of this relationship, it's really been quite fluid. It's not been well defined who should be doing what. So we want to have this kind of a model. In this, trying to set up this model to try and put people in these various places, there was a breakdown in communication. We know that we're in a transition period. We know that we can't have everything well defined and picture perfect, but we wanted to get agreement that this is the way we should go. We're having the same issues in other ministries, and part of the reality of what's going on, you can see here. Even though I know this is wrong, I've accepted that that is a real life problem that we will work with, that I will have these two hats, and we will move forward until I can extricate myself from this role and just retain this position. Everybody can see that. So I acknowledge that you can have a person at two positions, but not like this, when this is a permanent this is a permanent way of doing it. It was not a temporary thought. It had a permanency to it. This one I'm acknowledging from the beginning that this should not happen. So when we came to this discussion, we were happy as the leaders that the person who was leader one here could be the person who was here or the person who was here. So they essentially would have two hats. This would be or. This person could be this one and this one could be this one. It's not the ideal. You'd really want 3 people at a minimum, but if there's only a few people to work with, as a temporary position, we could essentially have person 1, and person 2. Hope we can see that. But I want to emphasize that this should be a temporary, transitional structure, because you really need to have 3 people. Leader 1, I say a person, it could be a board, it could be 4 people directing this work. In fact, in reality, it should be, not just an individual. So there could be 10 people here, or 9, 3, 3, and 3. This is what we wanted to move forward with across the world field, whether it's Africa, United States, Europe. We've had a breakdown in relationship here to the degree that the leaders of FFA here have actually left the camp, have not participated in the conference, and have withdrawn from participating in the work of the movement. So this is a brief overview of our understanding of how the organisation of this movement should be operating, what it should look like. If you're a local ministry leader, then you just take this model and you bring it into your own setting. So again, this is an example of what a local ministry would look like if they have a school and if they're involved in ministry work. They should certainly be doing this. Not everyone is operating a school, but if you are, there should be clear and distinct responsibilities and channels of communication and channels of responsibility. Our movement is small. We recognise that sometimes people have to take on 2 roles or 2 jobs at once. We factored all of those ideas into our suggestion of where this was going to go. So that's what our proposal was, and it was not accepted, and so therefore we no longer continue with the business meetings, and FFA left the camp and have returned home. Just want to add one more dynamic to this subject. The Midnight Cry message, this camp meeting in particular, is addressing an issue. Connected with the Midnight Cry message are a number of thoughts, a number of ideas. But one of the ones that we want to address here is leadership style. How we as leaders, and for those who are watching the video, I'm addressing the leaders of this worldwide movement, how we as leaders operate. Because every leader who is here has someone to answer to above and someone to minister to below. All of us find ourselves in this position, whether this was God and an elder below you, or a parent. In every situation, you will always find yourself in this kind of scenario. And we want to set a culture that we don't impose our will upon anybody, we don't force anybody to do anything. We were in discussions with School of the Prophets on this very issue since June, and my understanding was that the School of the Prophets were in agreement that the way you run a school is that nobody should be forced to do anything that they do not want to do. It's a culture that began here in Arkansas and has filtered all the way through our movement in the various schools that we have. And so if you run a School of the Prophet, we want you to know that the leadership have taken the position that any semblance of forcing people to do things that they do not want to do is not a model that we hold to and that we will support you in. So we want to set the tone correct, that entrance into God's kingdom cannot be based upon a principle of force. If people, I want to say foolishly, respond by saying, what do you do with children? There's a biblical response. When we were children, we behaved as children. But when we grew up to be adults, we should behave like adults. And these schools are not for children. They're not correction facilities for delinquent people. They're training schools for prophets. And if you go back to the Old Testament, the people that were selected to go to these schools were people who were earmarked to be prophets for God. And if that's the case, we should set a culture that's appropriate to that class of people. The reason why I mentioned that is because when the communications began to break down, the response from FFA went along this line. In parenthesis, we don't agree with your position. They do not agree with the leadership position. But because you are the leadership, we will obey you. Obey without question, but we don't agree. If you see the dynamic. Now that ethos, that principle has been running in almost every ministry that I've interacted with across the world field. This ministry is not the only one that's guilty. It is guilty of this, but it's not the only one. If you go to a school or a ministry where you force your students to do things they do not want to do, it's un-Christian, because we're not supposed to treat adults like children. And because of this issue, this point that we want to drive home from the very beginning of this camp meeting as we move forward with the concept of equality, is that we will no longer operate in this fashion. And we expect every single ministry from henceforth to operate on those lines, whether you run a school or a ministry. You should not be forcing students or staff members to do things they do not want to do. If they don't want to be compliant and they're a staff member, fire them. Terminate their position. If they're students, you may deal with them in an alternative fashion, but you will not punish them for doing things that they do not want you to do, that they do not want to do. This became important for the following reason. We asked FFA to agree with this model, and in principle, I want to emphasize this, they agreed with it in June, and they agreed with it this week. Every single step about the job role, what that role would entail, there was full agreement in that until we get to a certain point in our discussion, which I'll go on to now. Get water. When we disagreed on that point, an impasse, or there was a block in communication, and their position was, we don't agree with what you say, but because you're the leadership, we will obey. And our response was, we will not operate like that. If you don't agree, we will not insist. So we repeatedly asked the ministry what their opinion was, because we wanted to negotiate and discuss the things through. And their continued response was, we will just obey. When we got to that point, we said, we will no longer work with the ministry. And if we could quote actually what was said. This was our response as minuted.
Quoting Elder Parminder.
Turn on your mic.
Testing. Quoting Elder Parminder. I'm going to close the meeting now. I am not prepared to lead out in a ministry with these kinds of conditions and this kind of relationship. FFA is free to do what it wants.
So, essentially what I said in that statement was that if we cannot work on a basis of mutual respect, of discussion and agreed outcomes, we would not the meeting would stop and we would go no further. I would not work with the ministry on the basis that they would do what I tell them to do, what we would tell them to do, obey without question. We will not operate on those lines. There seemed to be an understanding on their part that what that meant was I was resigning from this position, that I was going to cut loose from being the leader of FFA, and if I was going to not be the leader of FFA, they took the position that they would no longer work with us. And that produced a cascade of effects, which I'll mention in a moment. But I want us to understand what that statement meant. I was never this person, ever. I never intimated it. It was never brought up. It was clear 2 months ago that Sister Bronwyn was the president, and everybody knows what a president is. If in FFA's mind, they thought that she was a puppet president and I was the real one, I never gave them, I never intimated that. I don't know why they would ever have thought that. So that statement meant the following. This person here, because this ministry is not willing to work on the way that this person says, which is free and open communication and agreed outcomes, then the ministry was free to do what it wanted and I would no longer work with them. This position, as you all can realise, is a position of responsibility, is not only dealing with one ministry or one school. There are other places in the United States that I have work to do with. And so if I'm not going to work with this individual ministry, it doesn't mean I'm not going to work with other ministries. They took this to mean the following. If I'm going to resign from this post, and I said FFA are free to do what they want, they took that literally and chose to be free to do what they want, and what they wanted to do was essentially either shut down their ministry or downsize their ministry or go in a different direction to the direction in which the leadership, not just me, the leadership of 4 elders wanted to take that ministry. And I want to reiterate that the direction in which we wanted to head, the details of it, like this should be a school that has a proper culture, this should be taking care of the flock in the United States, they all agreed with that structure. The breakdown happened, or the disagreement, when they said we don't agree, were on some detailed issues, which I will explain in a moment. So hopefully that is clear about what our direction was, the ethos that we are expecting the whole movement to begin to follow and to begin to implement, that we will not run this movement on an authoritarian leadership style. Leaders are meant to minister to their flock, not to drive them. So everybody watching or listening to this, I want them to be clear that the direction in which we want to take the movement, at whatever level you are, whether you're here or whether you're lower down, everybody has to implement, we expect everybody to implement this, what we believe is a common sense, respectful way of dealing with adults. And this goes hand in hand with the idea of headship is not to be practiced in our dispensation. We should have equality on race, on lines of nationalism, and on lines of gender, and on lines of leaderships where people deal with each other respectfully, and we do not force or impose our will upon people. Hopefully that should be clear. Most of the movement, or many people in the movement, by now, whenever this video goes out, almost all the movement will have already known by then that the working team, if it's pertinent.
Yeah. I don't recall in the meeting that you were speaking of here that it was mentioned that we will not allow the thought portrayed it. We will not allow individuals to be forced to do what they don't want to do. I don't specifically remember that being written or said in the meeting. I don't know if it has.
So let me reiterate that point. When we spoke about the ethos or the culture of the School of the Prophets, if students come, they would not be punished for non-compliance.
Yeah, I'm saying that I don't remember that being mentioned to us as a new rule. I don't remember that.
I mention it now because we're not dealing with FFA, we're dealing with a worldwide movement.
Yeah.
So at this conference, I'm saying this is an example of the direction in which we want to head, based upon the principle of equality, that people should be treated as adults and not children. The School of the Prophets in particular is run by Sister Bronwyn, Brother Tyler, Brother Larry, and Sister Angelia. It's a membership, a teamwork of 4. And essentially, Sister Bronwyn has the role of president or leader of School of the Prophets. That's the existing setup, this one here. What we wanted to put into place was that this side of this ministry here would be headed out by Brother Tyler, and this by Sister Bronwyn. So she would have 2 roles. Sister Bronwyn would be here, and as I say, we already recognise that this problem was back here. The sticking point came about the role of Brother Tyler and the level of autonomy or responsibility that he would have taking charge of this work. And that's where the problem arose. Initially, it then escalated beyond that. But that's where the problem began. There was a disagreement on that, and the end result was, if we force FFA to put this person in this position, they would comply. And we said we would not force that to happen, that we would negotiate, and we wanted to understand why they objected. And as we went through his resume, nobody could understand, none of the leaders could understand why there was an objection to him taking that role. There seemed to be nothing in his ability or his character or his personality that would indicate that that should not happen. So I think it suffices just to say that issue. We had a second meeting the next day after this meeting did not get resolved, and we came up with a second proposal based upon what we thought the leadership of FFA wanted. So we suggested that these people would swap roles. Sister Bronwyn would go here and Brother Tyler would go here. They'd swap. We thought that would be a preferential model that they would be happy. What we then discovered was that our second proposal was worse than the first one. As soon as these roles were swapped, the issue of finances came up. Anybody here who runs a ministry or a school realizes that schools basically drain the coffers of a ministry. So if there's the ministry, it's difficult because I've got ministry here. If this is the ministry, this entity takes all the money or most of it, especially the model that they have in America, and I think in other places too. The schools are really a drain on the resources of a ministry at this level. And what we didn't anticipate is when we asked to swap, essentially what would happen is that Brother Tyler with Brother Larry, who is the manager, so that's what our original position was. Then we would have Brother Tyler, Brother Larry, and Sister Angelia essentially running the school. We didn't define what their roles would be or their relationships, but just the three of them would run the school. Sister Bronwyn would lead out here. We know that a school takes all the money, but what we didn't anticipate what the objection would be. And so then it became an issue of who actually manages the vast resources of this ministry. Our understanding is that it would be all managed at this level here, but these people would have autonomy on how to spend their budget, how to run a school. My understanding is, and there are people nodding here, that that's how any business works. If you have a company, you have a division. The division is given a yearly or normally yearly budget, and they are free to spend as they wish, as long as it's within the terms and conditions or the ethos of the company. They don't do crazy things. If it's a phone company, the division doesn't start producing televisions. They just produce phones. As long as they're working within their remit, they have autonomy of self-governance. And that became the point where they would no longer move forward. The statement was made that if we cannot agree, because they would say, we'll just do whatever you tell us to do. We said no. Therefore they said, I said that I will no longer work with the ministry. They're free to do what they want. This person here will no longer work with this ministry until they're willing to come back and negotiate further along the line, whenever that would be, tomorrow, next week, next year, whenever. FFA misunderstood that. There are 8 people in that meeting. One of the persons abstained from making any comment. No, there's more than 8. There's 9 people. One of the people abstained from making any comment in that whole meeting. Sister Bronwyn was one of those 9. Her understanding was that I had washed my hands of FFA, I had left them, and they were now free to do what they want, which means I had resigned from this position. She took that as a sign that I had reneged upon my commitment to serve in the capacity of a leader. When she heard that statement, she then said that in that case, she was going to essentially shut down the ministry. When she took that position, the remaining 7 people, 4 elders and 3 workers, her co-workers, all were asked what their understanding of what that statement meant, and no one agreed with her position. The position that she took, no one agreed with that. And after some conversation, she ended up by saying this last statement, which again was minuted.
Testing. Sister Bronwyn, I heard the statement and I should have known that he did not mean that, and that he has long-term commitment to the movement, and I wish we could go back to where we were before the meeting.
So she admits that she misunderstood what I said based upon that everybody in the meeting had understood me to say. She regrets making the statement, making that position, and her desire to go back to the beginning of the meeting or have a reset. It was late. After she made that closing statement, we didn't have a chance to talk about it there and then, but I took that as a hopeful statement. So I asked for the meeting to be adjourned in the hope that tomorrow we could relook at things on that positive end. The meeting closed, they left, and without informing us, obviously they informed the organisers, they left the camp and they've returned home. That night, they began a series of communications, both with the workers, with Elder Jeff, we assume, we don't know for sure, but also across the world field. And if we could just go through the sequence of communications that they had. The times aren't important.
No times. Baptismal candidates across America received an email stating that the baptismal classes have been put on hold as Brother Tyler's employment at FFA and the School of the Prophets had been terminated.
So there are 60 people or more who received that email that Brother Tyler has been fired or his employment has been terminated, and therefore his baptismal classes now stop.
There was communication between Sister Bronwyn and Brother Larry, and they had a phone conversation where she said that she would not respond to calls or texts by others. She reassured Larry and Angelina that they would still have a place to live. Brother Larry understood that to mean his job was now on notice.
I, and I assume others, tried to reach out to her that evening to say there was a disagreement. We would ask that she would come back to the camp meeting where her duty lay and we would resolve the issue. But as per her statement, she has not communicated back because she said she would not communicate with anybody. And she's certainly not communicated with me.
Brother Tyler began to receive emails that ministry account passwords were being changed.
So the workers of the ministry begin to be locked out of ministry accounts, whatever those accounts are, email, YouTube channels, Facebook, etc.
Brother Tyler received an email stating that his employment was terminated effective immediately. The reason given was that his position is being eliminated as the ministry is downsizing. He was given 1 week's notice.
So we're not clear whether or not it's because FFA at this level is going to downsize and what that means, or whether they're shutting down the ministry. We don't have clarity on that yet. If you just take the statement, it's just downsizing, we don't know what that means. He was given 1 week's notice, and so we just want to make a comment to everybody who's listening to this. The worldwide movement, the leaders of this worldwide movement, have taken a position that we're in full support of Brother Tyler. We know nothing about his character or his doctrinal stance that would lead us to think that he should be terminated from a position in one of the leading ministries. We can't understand what he has done wrong. We see no insubordination, and we don't know any character defects that would warrant such an action. He certainly has not exhibited anything negative toward the Midnight Cry message. So we're in full support of him. We also want to add the note that whether or not it's a legal issue about giving 1 week's notice, we think it's an immoral position that this movement would give one of their brothers 1 week notice without taking any consideration of their financial situation, recognizing the long-term commitment that they have made. They've sacrificed careers, lucrative, potentially lucrative positions to work in God's service, and to treat someone that way, we believe is an immoral position to take.
The FFA and School of the Prophets Facebook pages were taken down. Brother Eber received a message stating that he is no longer required as a teacher at the coming School of the Prophets, as they have cancelled the upcoming trimester.
They were meant to have a trimester starting mid-September to the end of the year, and Brother Eber had made adjustments to his career path, so this affects him at a number of levels, and at short notice, without any explanation, his requirement or his job as a teacher for this trimester is just terminated without any explanation. Again, a few students that had made adjustments to their itinerary, we don't know what those were, they've been uninvited from the trimester, all at last notice, at short notice.
The next point was the students. One brother received an email, he was a student, stating that those at FFA and the School of the Prophets appreciated his willingness to join them at the ministry, and that they regretted to inform him that they had cancelled the upcoming trimester and that he needed to make other living arrangements. An email was sent cancelling all funding requests across the world field effective immediately.
Everyone knows in this movement that through God's providence, FFA have been richly rewarded in the area of money, and they have voluntarily taken the position that they would help support the work across the world field. This issue became a matter of contention in the meeting, but I just want to highlight the point that up until the point when the School of the Prophets was first born is the point where FFA began to receive substantial amounts of financial support around 2012, 2013. Up to that moment, our understanding is that they did not have a large operating budget. They were given seed money to start the school, substantial amount of seed money, and from that moment onwards, they have received large donations, we believe, through the providence of God, which has created this school. Many people have either seen pictures of the school or have been there. Many of you have been there, and we've seen that this school is a testament to God's providence and how he has led this movement. They have received financial support way beyond the needs and requirements of the school, way beyond the requirements and needs of the ministry in the United States. And they, of their own volition, because of their own perspective of what has happened, they have decided to take the position to support the work across the world field. As of this date, which was I think 2 days ago now, all funding requests have been stopped. All commitments to fund certain projects, we understand to have been stopped. That's all. So we're currently in a place where communication between the leaders of the movement and FFA ministry have now broken down. The ministry leader, Sister Bronwyn, has returned home, and the leaders of the movement have, the following day after the meeting, wrote a 7-page communication to Elder Jeff explaining our position, explaining our perspective, and asking to essentially intercede in this matter so that we could have reconciliation, so that we could draw back our brethren, and that we could move forward. We haven't had a response to that communication. Elder Tabo has been in communication with Elder Jeff. I don't know the details of that communication, they're private of course, but some things that we do know is that he's unwilling to meet with myself, unwilling to meet with Sister Tess, but he's willing to meet with Elder Tabo and I believe Elder Marco. The date...
So can you confirm that? Did you believe Marco?
I don't know if he was known. It's September the 4th today. The plan is that Brother Tabo will have meetings with Elder Jeff on Friday, September the 6th in Arkansas, face to face. Elder Tabo is travelling there tomorrow to try to resolve this issue. We all, of course, hope that there would be a positive move, a positive response on Elder Jeff's part to try to bring reconciliation to this matter. We're not sure what the future looks like. However, we have concerns about the way things are headed, both on a personal level and on a prophetic level. It's a concern that Elder Jeff has refused to communicate with me. I communicated with him, I think the very night where these things began to happen. He gave me a short reply back, which was couched in cryptic language. It wasn't clear what his position was, at least to me, neither to the other elders with whom I shared that information. And since then, he's refused to acknowledge any or respond to any of my communications. And I've tried to communicate with him a number of times. As I said, Sister Bronwyn has not communicated back. They have not responded back to our letter to him. Elder Jeff has not responded to that. So we see troubling signs about what's happening. We're aware that our understanding is that they're beginning to, or they're preparing to make a response to our position. So we expect a response from Elder Jeff in the near future. And of course, we don't know what that response will be, but from the little that we do know, it appears that response may well be negative. Our understanding when we first approached this conference was that we saw this as an interpersonal issue, that Elder Jeff was in complete agreement with the Midnight Cry message. He said that repeatedly, and we believe that he may well be. The problem is the Midnight Cry message is broader and wider and deeper than many people have anticipated. And one of the issues which we will develop in the next study is the issue of not only leaderships, but leadership styles, how we go about leading people. And we already see that FFA are failing that test just by the events of the past few days. If there is not an acceptance of the current leadership model by FFA or Elder Jeff personally, single one of us have to make a decision on what that means for us, what that means for the movement. Elder Jeff has consistently taught that he was a messenger of verse 40 and I was a messenger of verse 41 before he understood Sister Tessie's role in the movement. And today we would say, going along that line, that it would be Sister Tess and I which would be given the Sunday law message, which is essentially the third angel's message. So it's not me, it's Sister Tess that mantle at that level has been passed on to. There are multiple ways to understand these lines. If his position that all of the movement have accepted as being the voice of God, as being true, then to now reject this leadership puts him in the ministry in I think, an untenable position. So either he has to resolve this interpersonal difference, or he has to develop a prophetic line that says what he previously taught, what we are currently doing is incorrect, and that his prophetic narrative is the true one. We don't know if he will do that, but if he does, then it will be up to every single individual here to discern which prophetic model they're going to accept. If it ends up being just an issue of interpersonal problems, we hope that's resolvable. Elder Tabo is going there with our complete support and backing. He does not have a script. We don't know what the dynamics of that discussion will be, but he has our full support to do whatever he feels is necessary when he's there to try to reconcile this issue. If Elder Jeff begins to take a prophetic response to what's happening. He begins to build a prophetic argument about what's happening, and it would be centered around how you structure, not ministries per se, but how you structure authority and control in the movement. If he builds a model based upon that, then each and every one of you has to decide whether that prophetic model that he would bring forth is, obviously it will be different to our model, and which one would be correct. We've laboured for the past 12 months to show the methodology behind our movement, our message. We believe that it has integrity. Every single challenge that has been brought to us has been answered in a robust and strong fashion, and I don't know anyone in the movement who is openly stating that the Midnight Cry message has any error in it today. People may have difficulty with gender equality, but nobody is resisting that. We had 220 people at this conference, and we ordained a woman as not only an elder, but the leader of this movement, and there was not one single voice of objection. And this camp meeting had all the leaders of all the ministries across the world filled, barring Africa for logistical reasons, and there was no objection. So we know that just from those few thoughts that this movement is accepting the Midnight Cry message. They accept the methodology that undergirds it. If that's the case, we need to ask ourselves, how can there be another prophetic model that wars against our present position? I'll open up to questions now, if people have any questions.
First of all, you didn't give us a chance to object. So the people who should be anointed stood there, and nobody can say anything because it was already solved through the leadership. Only a remark from me.
So let me stop there. So the question was, there's no opportunity for people to accept or reject the people who are anointed. So I just want to make an observation on that point. When it comes to this position here, I think we made it clear that the role of Sister Tess was based upon a prophetic model. And if it's based upon a prophetic model that I think everybody agrees with, it wouldn't be a matter of voting whether or not they would accept her, because that would be voting whether or not we accept the prophetic model. When it came to the 3 Bible workers that were anointed, there was consultation with the ministry on that, but that, as normal, would happen with the ministry. If you go back last year and one of the workers at Finn were anointed, we did not vote on that either. It was a discussion between the ministry or the country of Germany and the leaders of the movement, so it's not out of line with that same ethos. So we weren't setting a new precedent. It was business as normal.
The second question is, in Italy you formed the sentence, obey without questioning, yeah? And you told us we all should obey without questioning.
So let me clarify what that means. Let me clarify, because I knew people would bring this point up. What does it mean to obey without question? What are we obeying? What we're obeying is this line. If we believe this line to be true, we should not be questioning the line. And from my experience, people never object to the line. What they object to is the implications afterwards. So when we come to the implications of what this line means, people do begin to object. So when we say now we need to not just obey without question, it's not in connection to a theological argument.
This is moral.
And I want to add this. What we're saying today is obey without question. Let me tell you how that scenario works. I go to this ministry and I say, we need to negotiate on how you are going to work. We want you to work this way. And they say, we don't like that way. So we say, let's negotiate how we get through this. And they say, we will not negotiate. So they're saying to me, you tell us what to do. Yep. I say, no. I say, we want you to tell us your opinion. And they say, we won't give our opinion, we just do what you tell us to do. So here it comes. I want that ministry to obey without question, and the obedience is, you will give us your opinion. You will obey and give us your opinion. If you want to follow through with that thought, that there's no change, it's consistent, now we're demanding people give their opinion on what they think about our ideas when we begin to implement these things. Because it's consistent with the idea of, in God's kingdom there should be no force. And when someone says, we will just follow you blindly because we like authoritarian leadership styles, we say, you are not obeying without question. So it's still in agreement with that idea.
Maybe you just need to re-clarify your statement. When you said no one objected to Sister Des being ordained as a minister and leader, maybe what you should say is that when it happened, no one objected or no one came to you. I mean, can I ask a question? Did Sister Bronwyn and Brother Jason, did they object to Sister Tess being ordained as a minister?
No, I don't believe so.
Okay, because I'm just wondering.
Well, they didn't. Sister, the leadership of FFA did not object to Sister Des being ordained as leader of the movement. I don't know Elder Jeff's position.
Oh, because I'm wondering why she's excluded for Jeff not seeing her. It's just Tabitha Marcos. I just wonder why she was excluded as well. But we don't know the answer to that.
I just have a comment. My comment is not regarding the firing of Tyler, but the portrayal of that they would not in any way possibly take care of his finances regarding his obligations to his home and whatnot. That doesn't match up with the previous record that FFA has handled people. So I would say that they more than likely in the past have, so I'm saying that they will be concerned about his financial responsibilities and not just throw them out.
We hope so, because we hope that they would, but I'm just basing it upon the communication that his last paycheck would be September the 9th in 3 or 4 days now. And if that's your last paycheck, unless it's it's not the normal paycheck, we believe that would be an unchristian position to take. We hope that it won't happen.
Yeah, I'm of agreement that they won't. Their previous track record shows that they have always done above and beyond.
Amen. That's what we would expect.
Yeah.
Would like to comment the line. You said that the time of the N magazine was 100% correct in '96. Yet today we say it's not 100% correct. Jeff, in contrast, says it was 50% correct and 50% wrong at that time. In regards to our standing today.
So yeah.
So
Oh.
I think it's essentially just saying the very same thing. Because, for example, if somebody gets into the message today and you give him a time of the End magazine, he's not up to date perhaps with the message, so for him the time of the End magazine today would be 100% correct also.
So let me clarify this point. The reason why this model of half right and half wrong is untenable, it's wrong, is because of the subject of dispensationalism. If we took this line and expanded it out, 89, 91, 96 and 911, here is a shut door, which means you can't go through to the next dispensation, the next room. So anything that happens here, this model is teaching you that this is the end. You don't have visibility past that. And in this dispensation, the only thing you know, because when you refer to half right and half wrong, it's the subject of the King of the South. And it's beyond the scope of this dialogue to discuss this, but at this camp meeting, what we identified is because of the issue of gender equality being the testing message in this dispensation, one of the components to it, the subject of gender equality is connected to the subject of the King of the South. Because if I could just do it simply like this, the King of the North is in the north, the King of the South is in the south, and we're in the middle. And this is the church, which should be balanced because you have church and state, and they're out of balance. If I were to do it perhaps this way, it would be church above state and state above church, and both models are wrong. And here we have to have church and state. So the issue of gender equality becomes a component of the Midnight Cry message, because here we're going to understand the role of the King of the South, which we didn't in this history. All we understood was, according to our version of Daniel 11 verse 40, it would receive a deadly wound, which it did. And that's all we understood, because there was no more light to be given. So when the light comes, the reason that we have further light on the King of the South is because of all of these issues. So in this dispensation, this document has to be understood to be 100% correct. Now, if you take a document and bring it into our history, now you have to have that document and you have to explain it. You can't give an outdated document to someone without explanation. And that document today is out of date. It would either need to be rewritten or it would need to be explained. If you hand out charts, the 1843 chart, it's out of date. The 1850 chart is out of date. They're all out of date, so they need explanation. What we tend to do is we tend to use charts or booklets as posters, as opposed to living, working documents. And as long as we do that, we're always going to fall foul of this issue to say that today, this document, if you bring it into our dispensation, is not 100% correct. So we should be explaining that whenever we hand them out.
Yeah, but that would imply, well, another word would be there's a progress of the development of the truth, right?
Yes,
Okay.
but it doesn't mean that this was half right and half wrong. It's not.
Okay, but it would say also that the message that Tess is preaching now could be completely wrong in the future because of the dispensation, isn't it? Implying it.
The reason why that cannot happen... Go ahead.
Or at least 50% wrong.
The reason why that cannot happen, she'll give her explanation, but I'll give one. She may have a completely different one. Is the line of the priests and the line of the 144,000, when this model was explained a year ago, people just took this as a theological statement. It has no impact upon us. Whether the 144,000 are priests and Levites, what difference does it make to any of us? It's just a moot point. But now we're beginning to see the implications of this. This is one of the things that I think is important for us to see and we don't recognise. When statements were made some time ago, like these are the same people just said, oh, that's interesting. That means we don't die, or it has much deeper significance, because if this was 2019, this would be 2019, this would be Panium, and this would be Panium, and this would be the Sunday law, if I can do it that way. And because they're the same person, 144,000 and the priests are the same people, I'm not going to explain some of the ideas behind that, but if you just take it at that face value, then what we know is what's being taught here in the history of the close of probation, or if you went to 2018, that you're inferring that if we were half right, half wrong, etc., dispensation is 100% correct. Dispensation is 100% correct, but when you go to the next one, there might be some mistake. First of all, I want to identify that I'll just come back to here. Because we're working on two lines, this waymark here, 2019, where all these truths are coming out now, what waymark is this? This waymark is the increase of knowledge. And this is the formalization, and this is the Sunday law, or the door. And one of the characteristics of the increase of knowledge is that there's no mistakes because it's an increase of knowledge. So in 2019, if we want to say in this story here, in this history from 18 to 19, it's 100% correct in our dispensation, but in this dispensation it will go to 50%. That's the argument you're making. You have to take this idea and bring it down to here, because this is the same dispensation. Panium, or Raphia to Panium, is not a new dispensation for the 144,000. It's the same dispensation, and therefore we know what's being taught today that's 100% correct for our dispensation is also 100% correct for this dispensation. So we know that what we're teaching now will not be adjusted or changed. It's 100% correct for all of this. I don't know what response you wanted to give.
I just wanted to note the difference between a mistake and a later development. So in 1996, I wouldn't say there's mistakes. I would say that in the next dispensation and the dispensation after that, we continue to have a development of the truth laid out in the Time of the End magazine. But I wouldn't go back and say that it's error. The fact that it expands doesn't make the original premise error. So just to differentiate between the two concepts.
And I think I said error, didn't I, which was probably not a good word, which is why we can take this document and actually use it today. Because if it was just error, we wouldn't use it.
Do we have any model for what is happening with Elijah and John the Baptist? Because both were Elijah was in a cave, disappointed, and we have John the Baptist in the prison.
So we may address that in the next presentation, I think. Yeah. What we're going to do, or Sister Tess will do next, is to lay out another prophetic. We'll recap what we did yesterday, but she'll lay out a new prophetic line, not a brand new one, but another one, to demonstrate a different perspective of what we think is happening today. Let's close with prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness and mercy. We want to ask and pray for a blessing upon us. Lord, whatever words have been spoken, whatever we have done or said, we ask and pray that it would be to your glory and your honour, and that it would not be used to do work of hurting or destroying people, but it would be the means of you reaching out to help and save your children. For all those people involved in this controversy, however directly or indirectly, we pray that you would be with them and bless them. We ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.